From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Gerald Feierstein, Senior Vice President at the Middle East Institute, filling in this week for Alastair Taylor. Today we're going to be talking about Saudi Arabia. The past week has been a dramatic one for the kingdom, both politically and economically. Several senior members of the Saudi royal family were detained by authorities, and the country launched an oil price war with Russia, triggering a massive drop in global oil prices, all in just a few days' time. To help make sense of recent developments and to understand what this means for the kingdom, for the region, and for the world moving forward, we're joined today by two excellent guests, Yasmine Farouk and Jean-Francois Seznec. Yasmine is a visiting fellow in the Middle East program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where her research focuses on Saudi Arabia and regional foreign relations. Jean-Francois is a scholar here at MEI, as well as a non-resident senior fellow at the Global Energy Center for the Atlantic Council and an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. A quick note before we get started. Today's episode includes a brief discussion of Saudi Aramco. Saudi Aramco has been a longtime sponsor of the Middle East Institute on a variety of programs and activities. Yasmine, Jean-Francois, welcome to the podcast, and thank you for joining us today. Yasmine, I'm going to start with you and ask you to talk a little bit about how you see things on the domestic side in Saudi Arabia, and particularly going back to last Friday when the Saudis very surprisingly arrested at least 4 senior members of the royal family, including King Salman's full brother, Prince Ahmed, and former Crown Prince Mohammed bin Nayef. It's triggered swirling rumors and speculation. What do you think happened?
It is not very easy to have access to what really happened, especially in Saudi Arabia these days. The access to information is not very easy because most people are too scared to talk. And when you see such actions, you understand why. But my personal view is that there was a reason why these arrests were made public. And as far as I understand, even the senior princes, they still could call their families. And many of those who were arrested were then released. I think the goal here was to send a warning message to everybody, especially, as I said, that it wasn't kept a secret. But at the same time, honestly, me reading this, I was thinking to myself, the Crown Prince has been in power since 2017. He has been known for being very ruthless and coercive, and he really went against all established traditions in the family in terms of respecting hierarchy, in terms of using coercion against princes and even senior princes. And here we see him having to go as high as it takes to secure his potential accession to power. To me, that's more a signal of concern and not just a signal of someone, being in control and knowing everything that's going on. If there is a concern from a prince who is not active, who is Prince Ahmed, he's not politically active, he's not particularly charismatic, but there is a concern that he has some kind of legitimacy, and in case he might want to use it, it might actually work. And so this is how I looked at it. And also I've been reading a lot, a sentence that we haven't necessarily have been reading many times before, that this might be in preparation of an abdication by the king. And it is true that a scenario in which King Salman would abdicate to the crown prince, like what happened in Qatar before, while staying alive, is the safest scenario for succession in Saudi Arabia. And so I think we should read into this another step, definitely, in securing his accession to power, but also that the worries and concerns about how smooth this succession would go are still there.
So if we can drill down on that a little bit, because, of course, the move, the suddenness, the drama of the move triggered a whole flurry of rumors that the king was either dead or was on his deathbed, such that, in fact, they had to trot the king out the next day for what seemed to me to be a rather contrived, event of receiving or providing the credentials to Saudi ambassadors about to go overseas. So if the king were to abdicate as opposed to dying in office, does that mean that the king would then be able to immediately hand over to the crown prince, or would it still have to go through the accession council?
We do know that the Allegiance Council for a few years now doesn't have a head, and that there are at least, again, if I'm not mistaken with the numbers, 3 members who did not necessarily vote for the crown prince to become crown prince, including Prince Ahmed.
Yes.
I have also heard that the vote was done in a non-traditional way, like we have been seeing things going on in Saudi Arabia in non-traditional ways. It wasn't really a consensus as we used to see it in such cases and in succession. And again, if you look at the case of Prince Ahmed, he's someone who abstained. He's someone who remained low profile and went back to the kingdom at a time when the campaign started against the kingdom, a campaign of hostility here in the US and in Western capitals. And so to me, what was also noticeable is that this decision and these arrests came at a time when people like me and other experts, we were thinking, oh, things have been going kind of quietly. There might be actually a learning curve here, because remember last November, Saudi Arabia had started negotiating with Qatar. We saw press reports that Saudi Arabia was no longer against a dialogue with Iran. In November, also, they arrested people inside Saudi Arabia, but then they released them. And so, we saw them preparing for the G20 summit and all this narrative that this is going to be a new page in Saudi Arabia, and they're really capitalizing on it. And then all of a sudden you have again 2 unpredictable decisions, whether the arrests or the oil prices. And so to me, that's what's curious about this. Why in the lead up of the G20, while you're preparing the whole world to turn a page and try to improve the image of Saudi Arabia, do something like this now?
Exactly. And to look at how it's affected the global environment, we saw, of course, President Trump called Mohammed bin Salman the other day. They had a brief phone conversation, not entirely clear what they talked about. But wouldn't the concern be, precisely as you said, that what this move has done has revived all of the doubts about Saudi stability, about the capacity of the crown prince, about his state of mind? Are these now issues that you think are going to affect the Saudi-U.S. relationship at this point?
Not at this point, because there are so many other issues right now affecting the relationship. And there is also the coronavirus that is keeping everybody busy. I think the oil decision, more than the arrests within the royal family, would be more concerning to the United States right now. Because again, this is not the first action of its kind that the crown prince takes against members of his own family or against senior officials in the kingdom. And we haven't really seen this come up a lot in the discussions of the impact on the U.S.-Saudi relationship. We've seen more talks about the Ritz-Carlton and its impact on the business environment. We have seen more of talks about, the arrests of women activists, the war in Yemen, the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. What's going on inside the royal family? The U.S. has traditionally been very cautious not to intervene in this, again, because it's very opaque. Yeah. I think the closest this administration came to intervening in royal politics was right after the Jamal Khashoggi murder, when there were talks about the need to change the entourage of the crown prince that is advising him on such issues. But otherwise, he has been pushing the limits, and I haven't seen any reaction specifically from the Trump administration. And as far as I read, the call was more about the oil decision, which is more important at this time, a time, of coronavirus, a time of U.S. elections, than about the arrests.
So, Jean-Francois, I think that Yasmine is trying to hand off the ball to you. So let me follow up on that. A series of events, a failed OPEC ministerial in Vienna, rumors of clashes between the Saudis and the Russians over reductions in production, over the way forward for OPEC Plus, whether it's going to collapse as an organization. But the bottom line is that with the global economy already suffering from the impact of coronavirus, is this really a time that you would choose to trigger a price war?
Well, it depends what I want to achieve. And if I want to achieve that Russia has to agree with me and agree to take real cuts, unlike what they've agreed in the past of taking cuts and never implementing them, this is probably a good time to do that, assuming you can afford the losses that both sides will take. And knowing that the prices would decline to $30, now they're at $35, but say $30 a barrel, definitely Saudi Arabia will suffer a great deal. It will increase their deficit to maybe $120 billion. The Russians will suffer a great deal, and most of all, the United States will suffer. So I think altogether, the timing, if you want to really start controlling prices, as I think Mohammed bin Salman does, then it's really trying to teach a lesson, a bloody lesson to your main competitors. Now, whether or not he will achieve in that, and for Mohammed bin Salman to take on somebody as clever, smart, experienced as Putin is pretty risky. I mean, he's not the smartest necessarily compared to Putin. I mean, I'm not sure who's going to win that battle, but that's where the battle's taking place. So I think in the long run, however, the Saudis have decided that they must take action now because the demand has been totally cratered by the coronavirus. They've actually said they would increase production by 25%.
Yes.
And they were joined by the Emiratis this morning, who said they will also increase by about 25%. So that means that there'll be an absolutely glut of oil, which ensures the prices will go down extensively. Now, the advantage to the Saudis is that, yes, it will hurt the U.S. producers. It will very much hurt the Russians. But whether or not they can be hurt enough for the Saudis to regain control of the market, I'm not sure.
Didn't the Saudis try this once before a few years ago? And if I recall correctly, the outcome was not entirely what they hoped for.
Yeah, and let's go back 30 years. They tried that 30 years ago with Ahmed Zaki Yamani, who cut production actually unilaterally to 2 million barrels from 10 at the time, and that failed as well. So, for them to think they can actually control all this is very tricky. But they do have, we're talking about people here who do not necessarily know the markets very well. Now, you remember in October, Khaled Al-Faleh, who is then Minister of Oil and Chairman of Saudi Aramco, a highly respected person who knows the markets very well, was fired because he did not agree with the Crown Prince on how to go about controlling the oil and the downstream for Saudi Arabia. Now, there's no one in that situation in Saudi Arabia who has the wisdom and the experience and the contacts to really manage this situation. I think we just have a sort of a 4 o'clock in the morning tweet in the Saudi format, saying, well, we're just going to, increase production and we're going to stop negotiating with the Russians.
So Yasmine, I think that Jean-Francois is suggesting that we're in for a period of belt tightening inside of Saudi Arabia.
Yes.
The Crown Prince, of course, has launched into this extremely ambitious project, Vision 2030, and presumably a protracted price war will damage that transition that he's trying to accomplish. It certainly will put Saudi Aramco into a more difficult position. If he was counting on Saudi Aramco to finance an awful lot of these, or SABIC to finance an awful lot of these new projects that he's trying to launch, it's going to make it more difficult for him. How do you see this playing out internally? What will be the attitude of the Saudi man or woman on the street as they see this this more straitened circumstance?
So as of yesterday, we've been reading in newspapers that there were already directives to different ministries to cut their budgets below the budget that was announced, because the Saudis are taking this seriously and they are willing to contain in this policy as long as the negotiations with the Russians might be taking. There has been a reaction on Twitter because the public expects that the gasoline prices will go down since the price of the oil on the international market is going down. And I think it has been announced that some prices will go down and some won't. And it is actually curious because every time there are talks about, cutting subsidies or changing the prices of oil or of commodities or imposing taxes, the Saudis almost immediately make a comparison with the reign of King Abdullah, who was very conservative when it came to imposing an additional cost of living on the Saudis. But you should also remember that currently, with the cut of subsidies and imposition of new taxes, the government is still paying money to citizens in order to compensate through individual bank accounts or other raises in the salaries. So, they are willing to tighten the belts, and they already, as I told you, notified their ministries of the need to do so. But the Saudi public in general have almost no venues to criticize or to voice this criticism aside from Twitter. Right. And again, there is a division between those who think that we should pay the price of a more activist international role and that we should, stand up to Russia, and those who are, again, as I told you, comparing it to the era of King Abdullah, where they didn't have to go through this socioeconomic instability. Mm-hmm. To me, what was also remarkable as I was reading Saudi newspapers yesterday is that there was a tone that this is Russia's fault. That it all came from Russia. The Russians didn't want this, and so they are causing instability on the oil market. And to me, it was curious because, it's blame Russia,
but it's not only common, but the fact is Russia always promised to cut in the past 3 years, and they never really did. So they've lost a lot of credibility in the kingdom, and I think that's what the newspapers picked up on.
So is that one of the driving factors here, that in fact the Saudis have basically gotten fed up with the Russians?
Well, they've lost trust. Now, there was never very much trust anyway,
right.
But I think they've lost really the trust that there was to have the OPEC plus.
Yeah.
But again, when you put it in the larger geopolitical context, and all the fantasy this revived about, a Russian-Saudi strategic partnerships that goes beyond the oil market. And, during his last visit to Saudi Arabia, Putin was, extremely well received in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And it was at the time, right after the attacks against Aramco. And you could read in the newspapers, well, the United States is no longer here for us. We cannot guarantee it. We should diversify our strategic partnerships and, Putin, I think, gave a long interview to the Al Arabiya channel. But as you said, exactly, there was never trust. The Saudis knew they couldn't trust. And it could be, as the professor said, that, they have been very patient with the Russians, only for the Russians at the end to say, and you know what, we're actually not even going to promise you this.
And the Russians on the other side, and I totally agree with what you said, I think from the Russian standpoint, the Russians said, yes, but okay, we want to support you. We will cut one of these days. We will cut production, but you must invest tens of billions of dollars in our economy. And of course, the Saudis didn't. So,
but the Qataris did.
Well, and then the Qataris left OPEC, and they said, we have nothing to do with this deal.
So the trust, there was not one step each, to increase trust. The trust was never there on each side.
Yeah, but, the Saudis did flirt with this ideas of...
Yeah.
And what if we took the Russians seriously as a partner? But before I forget, you asked a question about Aramco. Also, Aramco's value plummeted very low, in the past few days. And this is something that is sensitive to the Saudis, because you've been hearing Saudi officials saying the media coverage of the Aramco IPO has been very biased and unfair. Well, this is not the outcome that they were expecting, and this is not the outcome that was expected in general.
Well, and of course, now you have a lot of Saudis who are shareholders in Saudi Aramco who are watching their portfolios value plummet as well. They can't be terribly happy either.
There is a humorous point here, is that most of the shares that were bought by the Saudis were actually financed by the Saudi banks, who are in turn controlled by the Public Investment Fund. So that if they start losing money,
taking its own hit.
Yes, right.
And it was approached as a patriotic campaign.
Yeah.
Like, we are going to do this because the world is against us, so we are going to invest in our national pride.
Right. Especially if it's financed by somebody else.
Yes.
And we'll definitely, just to finish answering your question, the impact on Vision 2030. The Vision 2030 and the different projects were already under assessment, because this is the phase of the national transformation. And so they were already being assessed. And there will definitely be an impact on the vision and the implementation of the vision. However, as I was reading yesterday, I hope they don't materialize, but it seems like the contracts for the Entertainment Authority to host events and concerts are still going on. So I don't know if this also shall be reviewed, but there will definitely be an impact.
Interesting. And Jean-Francois, there are, of course, the rumors that Khaled Al-Faleh, who was the energy minister, is currently the investment minister.
Correct.
Is actually having some quiet behind-the-scenes conversations with his former Russian counterpart, Novak. Do you think that at the end of the day, we're going to see some kind of a deal struck between the two sides that's going to end this conflict?
If anyone can actually broker a deal, Khaled Al-Faleh is the one, absolutely. Whether or not the hard feelings are, so powerful that it will not happen, but de facto, I think we are seeing Khaled Al-Faleh coming back. And I think that's, from a purely political standpoint, I think it means a lot, because he has a totally different vision of the development of the country than the Crown Prince. And now the Crown Prince feels that he has to sort of listen to the guy who knows something. And that is very interesting to me.
Absolutely. And we're kind of running short on time, but I did want to ask you, Yasmine, one more very quick question, and that is, of course, we have two major events coming up on the Saudi calendar over the next 6 months. One, the Hajj, the annual Hajj, which is this year in August. And then, of course, the G20 summit. And the Saudis are really looking at that as a way of putting them very squarely at the center of the global political and economic universe. How do you see all of those things playing out in this age of coronavirus?
Well, For the Hajj, I see a very heavy impact, of course, on the economic and financial side, because this, what we call religious tourism in Saudi Arabia is an important source of revenue to the Saudis. And it is, let's say, an annual reminder of Saudi Arabia's importance in the Islamic world, of its status, of the resources it has to manage such an event, of the maintenance of its influence in the Islamic world at a time when this influence is being challenged. So I would, of course, watch this closely, but so far the Saudis have been very cautious and doing whatever it takes to control the coronavirus outbreak. They have an extensive experience in managing the masses of the Hajj, and I don't think they would be taking risks when it comes to this. As for the G20, many elements, to be honest, are working against them. I mean, you have the coronavirus, but you always have the chance of an attack by the Houthis, even if it's a minor attack, right. But just, to have to make a political noise, you always have the Iranian chance of attacks either through the Houthis or from Iran, despite Iran being in a very weak position right now. And we also don't know what other unpredictable decisions the Crown Prince might be taking from here until the G20. Remember, right after the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, there was also a G20 summit. And questions all over Western capitals are what are we going to do with the photo? Where are we going to be? Will we shake his hand? How would we shake his hand? And so it's really up to the Saudis now to make this decision on the oil market and the arrests, maybe the final ones before the G20, in order not to remind the world that Saudi Arabia is still not stable, that there is still unpredictability. And it would be such a waste of resources, because currently they are, deploying many resources and human capital in preparation of the G20 summit, capitalizing on it as presenting the real image of Saudi Arabia that some Western capitals still don't want to see. And so, aside from the coronavirus outbreak, it is within Saudi Arabia's hands to make this, a successful event, to give themselves a chance to start improving whatever broken image former policies have caused.
And to an almost unprecedented extent, the ownership of either the success or the failure of these things will be on the shoulders of Mohammed bin Salman.
He wanted it to be this way. And when you go to Saudi Arabia, you see it as being this way. He championed this, and this comes with a cost. It comes with a responsibility.
I'm afraid we're going to have to leave things there for today. But Yasmine, Jean-Francois, thank you both for joining us on the program. And thank you as well to our audience for listening in, and to our production team for their work on today's program. We'll see you all next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.